Hello, my dear friends. Welcome to my channel Sleepy History. Before we begin tonight's story, please tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? I love seeing sleepy souls from all around the world. And hey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a little comment, even emoji, to let me know you're here. Now, let your body relax. Lie down on your bed. Turn off the lights. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath in, and gently let it out. Let go of the day. Let go of all thoughts. Just be here with me in this quiet moment. And as we begin tonight's journey into history, let your mind drift. Let your body rest. And slowly, gently, fall asleep with the story. Hello everyone. Tonight, we explore a story. A crown of thorns, not laurel, a ruler for only a breath of Rome. Galba, the emperor who rose from ashes and walked briefly through flame. He wore age like armor, silence like a blade, and duty like a curse. When emperors fell like autumn leaves, he stood stern, worn, fated. One man against the whirlwind of a dying dynasty. And though his reign was short, the shadow he cast was long. The boy who dreamed in marble and ashes. Galba, born as Servius Sulpicius Galba, came into this world on the 24th of December, 3 BCE, in the ancient town of Terracina, not far from the salty breath of the Tyrrhenian Sea. The empire still hummed with the harmony of Augustus, the first emperor, and though the streets glistened with triumph, storm clouds brewed quietly in the Senate's breath. Galba's family was as old as the Republic itself, proud and steeped in nobility. His lineage stretched into the heart of Rome's patrician soil. His father, Gaius Sulpicius Galba, was a respected senator. His mother, Mumia Achaica, carried the blood of Quintus Lutatius Catulus, a consul and general of famed discipline. In him, Rome's past stirred not in the fire of revolution, but in the cold stillness of its marble roots. As a child, Galba was different. Where others laughed, he watched. Where others ran, he listened. Thin, solemn, and silent, he often wandered the villa gardens alone, his fingers grazing olive bark, his eyes tracing the fluted columns like they whispered to him of ancient laws. His nursemaid once said he never cried, not once. His earliest words were names of gods and emperors, spoken not with joy, but with gravity, like someone already mourning the world. He saw his mother pass when he was still small, and though the villa remained full of servants, voices, and echoes, it grew suddenly hollow. His father, burdened by Senate duty, drifted through rooms like a shadow in a toga. Galba would sit in the atrium, staring into the impluvium pool, imagining faces of emperors drowned in time. Rome wasn't just a place to him, it was a weight pressing on his young chest. But there was something unwavering in his eyes, even as a boy. His tutors remarked on it often. He studies history like a mirror, one said, not to see the past, but to find the future. He was not born in a palace. He was born among the echoes of Roman pride, in a world where empires devoured their children. And though the world did not know it, this quiet child, dreaming beside cracked marble, would one day become emperor, if only for a breath. The villa at Terracina stood like a monument to order, quiet courtyards, sun-warmed mosaics, and marble busts of ancestors watching from every alcove. Young Galba lived not in the joy of childhood, but in the gravity of memory. The scent of laurel, the hush of incense from the lararium, and the echo of sandals across mosaic floors became the music of his earliest years. His world was a gallery of stillness and expectation. He rarely smiled. His tutors, often stern men sent from Rome, tried to break through his silence with philosophy and language. But Galba preferred to study alone, tracing scrolls by lamplight, poring over Livy's history and the stoic musings of Seneca the Elder, long before those names were fashionable in the empire's halls. He has the eyes of a statue, one teacher whispered, but the mind of a soldier. He showed no fondness for games, no taste for performance or praise. What he sought was structure, law, lineage, and the silent rules that govern power. When other boys carved wooden swords, Galba memorized the consular fasti, the long marble list of Rome's magistrates. He understood that history was a weapon sharpened by memory. His father, Gaius, became colder with each passing year. Not cruel, simply distant. The grief over Mumia Akeka's death had frozen something in him. Occasionally, he would walk with young Galba under the olive groves and recite battle honors, or speak of the laws debated in the Senate, yet never as a father, always as a citizen, always as Rome. Galba's only warmth came from his nursemaid, a quiet Greek woman named Antigone, who once whispered to him tales of Orestes and the curse of kings. He would fall asleep listening to those stories of fates twisting the lives of men, of glory that bloomed and died like lilies in flame. One day, a messenger arrived. The emperor, Tiberius, brooding from his island exile at Capri, had sent word. The boy Galba was to be taken to Rome for further tutelage, for he showed a noble bearing and the stiffness of ancient virtue. Tiberius had noticed him, or rather, had noticed his bloodline. In Rome, more eyes would fall upon the silent child. So at the age of 12, Galba left Terracina. He stood once more beneath the painted sky of his family villa, looked at the cracked bust of his grandfather, and whispered, "I will not be forgotten." He didn't cry, not then, not ever again. The chariots clattered, the forums roared, and Rome eternal, restless, alive, swallowed Galba whole. He arrived as a boy of 12, but within months, the city had already reshaped him. His tutors brought him to the Palatine Hill, to the Forum of Augustus, and to the towering libraries where echoes of Cicero still whispered from the stone. He walked through colonnades of power and fire, watching the Senate men in their togas argue over shadows and statutes, and he learned to listen with his soul, not just his ears. Galba's new home was a domus near the Capitoline Hill, sponsored by a distant uncle within the Sulpici clan, a man with influence, though not affection. Rome had no warmth for its children. It tested them, measured them. He was tested daily in philosophy, oratory, and law, but even more so in patience. He watched other noble sons laugh, drink, and duel, but Galba never strayed. He stayed within the rhythms of discipline, quiet and unmoving as a marble statue in a storm. Still, Rome was never without its lessons. One afternoon, during a private visit to the Temple of Jupiter, Galba witnessed a senator berate a priest over omens, a public disgrace hidden behind ritual. That night, he wrote in his wax tablet, "Power is not loud, it waits." It was a phrase he would live by all his life. There were times, however, when the child in him stirred. He would sneak away to watch the theater of Pompey, not for plays, but for people. He studied their faces' laughter, deceit, adoration like a tactician learning a battlefield. His favorite place was not a garden, but the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, not for its filth, but because it reminded him. Even empires need silent things beneath them to survive. He was briefly introduced to the aging Emperor Tiberius during a Senate ceremony. The old man's gaze met Galba's, cold and calculating. Later, Tiberius remarked, "That boy has Caesar's quiet, dangerous, if ever awakened." Galba took this not as warning, but as prophecy. And so the boy who had once wandered the olive groves of Terracina now wandered through history's corridors in living flesh. He did not laugh, but he watched. He did not speak much, but what he did say was never forgotten. His nursemaid had once told him, "History is not made by those who burn bright, but by those who endure." He remembered her words every time the stones of Rome cooled under moonlight. The days in Rome passed like parchment burned by slow flame. Galba, now a youth in his late teens, had become a creature of rhythm and ritual. His limbs had lengthened, his shoulders hardened under Roman steel, but the gaze calm, cold, ancient remained unchanged. He was no longer the silent boy from Terracina. He was now a shadow among the marble halls of senators, a name whispered at feasts, a presence that unnerved even his peers. His education took place not only in scrolls and rhetoric, but in silence, long hours in the Forum Romanum, watching pleaders and pontiffs wrestle with words like swords. He was trained by philosophers in the Stoic tradition. The famed Musonius Rufus once examined his logic and pronounced, "He lacks warmth, but not reason. He will be one who obeys law as others obey hunger." Galba practiced speech with obsessive discipline. He would spend nights alone, reciting Cicero's Pro Malone, trying to match his rhythm, but emotion never came easily to him. His words were like polished, stone-measured, heavy, but often bloodless. Still, the power in them could not be denied. Even at 18, magistrates listened when he spoke. His body, too, became a reflection of Rome. He trained under military officers who had served in Germania, spending months along the Via Flaminia, learning how to endure cold, pain, and command. His frame grew lean, his voice deepened into something unshakable. He never boasted, but when he gave orders, even seasoned centurions did not question him. Galba's uncle, a consul named Lucius Livius Ocella, arranged his first ceremonial role, quaestor in training, attached to a minor tribunal overseeing property law. Though most youths used such positions for leisure and flirtation, Galba treated it as sacred duty. He pored over land records like they were poetry, learned every clause of the Lex Aquilia, and once stayed awake 2 nights to memorize ancestral decrees of the Julian laws. Rome, by now, had begun to notice. Letters bearing his name were seen on benches near the Basilica Julia. A statue, small one, carved in cheap stone, was raised outside a civic hall with the words, "To Sulpicius Galba, son of Gaius, whom the law honors." It was nothing grand. But Galba touched the base of that statue one evening and whispered, "Not for pride, for legacy." And yet, within this furnace of excellence, he was alone. He had no true friends, no confidants. He never laughed in public, and rarely in private. He kept journals long, meditative scrolls on fate, duty, and the silence of the gods. One phrase appears often: "Let me not love too much, nor be loved too deeply." For even then, Galba feared what love might cost in a city where love was often poisoned by power. Rome teaches in whispers, not roars. And Galba, now nearing 20, listened well. His ears were tuned not to applause, but to murmurs in corridors, flickers of doubt in a senator's voice, the hesitation before a toast. These were his textbooks now, and he read them like scripture. Though still young, Galba had become a regular face in the quieter corners of the Curia Julia. There, amidst cold marble and cooler ambition, he observed the web of influence tightening under Emperor Caligula's reign, and how easily men changed faces to match the throne. His own family had begun to draw notice. The Sulpici were respected, though not supreme. But Galba's quiet rise and the precision with which he moved made more seasoned patricians pause. He did not seek popularity, he sought position, and more importantly, immunity. His uncle, Lucius Livius Ocella, had secured him a more senior appointment, praetor, elect, a title still years from power, but heavy with expectation. Behind that title came dinners, audiences, and private conversations. It was during one such evening, in a villa near the gardens of Sallust, that Galba dined with Senator Domitius Afer, a man known for both genius and venom. Afer, with wine-stained lips, leaned in and whispered, "You walk like you already wear the purple. Be careful Rome chews such men into silence." Galba merely bowed. "I do not seek the purple," he said. "I seek the spine that must bear it." Such statements became common among those who knew him. He did not flatter, he never shouted, he simply existed with a gravity that unsettled. Rumors began to circulate. Some claimed he was born under a star of war, others that he practiced private rites to unknown gods. In truth, Galba did pray to Mars, to Saturn, and most of all, to Vesta, the goddess of endurance. He would leave offerings in secret near her flame on the Palatine, beneath the watchful eyes of the Vestal virgins. They never acknowledged him, but they never turned him away. His education shifted from scroll to strategy, Galba studied logistics, taxation, grain routes, and border law. He traveled with minor governors to Sicilia, Cisalpine Gaul, and Baetica, watching how provinces were kept calm, not by might, but by grain, gold, and gossip. He noted how men cheered one consul and stoned another with equal passion, depending only on bread. And quietly, as all this flowed around him, Galba began to record his own philosophies. He wrote, "To rule Rome is not to command men, it is to command fear. One must outlast both loyalty and betrayal." He was not loved. He did not need to be. Even the coldest stones know warmth for a moment. And Galba, beneath the chill of discipline and duty, once let his heart pulse freely, far from scrolls and Senate whispers. It happened not in Rome, but in Sicilia, during a minor appointment meant to observe provincial court procedures. There, among olive groves and quiet villas, lived Aemilia Lepida, a noblewoman of fallen fortune. Her father, once governor of Crete and Cyrene, had been disgraced in a tax scandal and sent into quiet exile. Yet Aemilia remained untouched by shame, radiant in restraint, a woman who wore her sorrow like pearls. She and Galba met during a harvest ceremony. He was there to give a short address on imperial gratitude. She stood among the crowd in a deep olive cloak, her eyes locked not on the altar, but on him. That night, they spoke in a courtyard garden heavy with jasmine. She challenged him, questioned his silences, his endless caution. "Is there blood in you, or just law?" she asked once, her voice half mirth, half melancholy. "I bleed in private," he replied, his voice quieter than the fountain beside them. Their courtship was brief, but vivid. Aemilia was unlike Rome's other women. She read Virgil aloud under moonlight, wrote satirical verses mocking the imperial court, and once declared that Galba's seriousness would either save him or strangle him. He smiled that evening, a rare, flickering thing. But he did not laugh. They spoke of marriage. She dared to believe it. But Galba hesitated. Her family's disgrace could endanger his already precarious ascent. Worse still, his advisors, especially his uncle, warned against any entanglement not approved by Rome's political elite. In the end, he left. Without warning, he departed Sicilia in early spring aboard a small ship bound for Ostia. Aemilia watched from the harbor as his figure vanished into dawn fog. He never wrote. Back in Rome, rumors fluttered that Galba had broken a noble heart, that he had loved and failed. He never confirmed or denied. Instead, he poured himself deeper into discipline. His journals from that year are sharper, colder. One entry reads simply, "Affection is a weakness, dressed in perfume." Yet, years later, a poem appeared anonymously in a Sicilian shrine. He came like winter, cold and proud, left spring to grieve beneath a cloud. My heart once beat, now law must bind. The laurel blooms, but leaves love blind. No name was signed, but locals whispered it was Aemilia's hand. And Galba? He never loved again, not truly. In Rome, love was seldom soft. It was weighed, calculated, measured in lineage, and whispered in corridors before it was ever spoken aloud. And so it was with Servius Sulpicius Galba, whose heart once stirred by the wind song of Aemilia Lepida, now hardened beneath layers of expectation. His marriage was arranged, as most of his kind were, not by affection, but by necessity. The chosen bride, Aemilia Lepida. No, not his lost love, but another of the same name. A distant cousin of the woman he had abandoned in Sicilia, this Aemilia was of noble birth, politically unblemished, and deeply connected to the old patrician class through the Cornelii Scipiones. A clean name. A sharp mind, a quiet voice. They wed in Rome, in a domus nestled between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, beneath garlands of olive and myrtle. The ceremony was formal, austere. Guests recited old poems and offered sacrifices at the altar of Juno, goddess of marriage. Galba stood still throughout, his expression unreadable, his bride serene yet distant, like a statue carved for diplomacy. What passed between them in private was never spoken of publicly. Some said they lived in mutual silence, coexisting with the grace of marble pillars. Others whispered that Emilia saw the shadows behind Galba's ambition and chose not to disturb them. They had 2 sons, neither of whom survived into manhood. One died in infancy, lost to fever. The other, Gaius Sulpicius Galba, reached adolescence before perishing in a riding accident near Antium. Galba, by all accounts, was not broken by the loss, not visibly. When news came of his son's death, he spoke only once. Rome does not pause for the weeping of fathers. Yet, in the weeks that followed, he was seen walking the gardens of Lucullus alone, long after dusk, whispering to no one. Aemilia faded early from the public eye, possibly due to illness. Some suggest she died quietly in their villa near Tiber, attended only by her servants and a physician. Others claim she entered a private temple order and renounced worldly life. Whatever the truth, her name left few echoes. Galba never remarried. In time, courtesans and whispers replaced affection. He was known to favor younger men for companionship discreetly, carefully, never scandalously. Rome was tolerant, so long as such indulgences did not cloud judgment. Galba's never did. If anything, they made him sharper, colder. He wrote in his private scrolls, "The empire is not one with roses. It is forged where softness cannot live." And so, he continued, ever more alone, his path lined with statues and shadows. The years after his marriage passed like a long corridor lit only by the flicker of ambition and the soft shuffle of sacrifice. Servius Sulpicius Galba now matured into the kind of Roman the Senate respected, restrained, learned. Emotionally distant, moved through these years with all the grace of someone who had buried love beneath layers of marble and protocol. His marriage had stabilized his status. His name carried weight, and his family's long-standing loyalty to the old republic granted him cautious favor from emperors like Tiberius and Caligula. Yet Galba did not chase influence with vulgar haste. He allowed others to rush, to claw, to flatter. He stood still, and in Rome, that too was a statement. During these years, he rose as praetor and then consul, positions granted not only for lineage, but for his governance, which was famously strict, yet oddly just. He was sent to Gaul, then Africa, where he gained admiration from provincial governors for his refusal to take bribes and his harsh but orderly taxation policies. But his heart remained sealed. Even after the death of Emilia, who passed in the quiet of Tiber, attended by handmaids and a single Greek physician, Galba did not mourn publicly. At her funeral, he wore black, spoke the required rites, and left before the pyre had turned fully to ash. It was said that, afterward, he burned all her letters and had her portrait removed from his villa's atrium. There was one man, however, who re-entered his life then, Titus Vinius, a cunning, ambitious figure with a shadowy past. Vinius had once served under Galba in Gaul, and though once disgraced for theft, he wormed his way back into Galba's confidence. Some whispered of a deeper bond, a friendship bordering on dependency, or, perhaps more. Galba's enemies would later use it against him. But for now, Vinius served as both advisor and companion, his voice often heard behind Galba's silences. Galba remained childless, heirless. He began to adopt the habit of keeping busts of Rome's great men in his study. Scipio Africanus, Augustus, even Cato the Younger. At night, he would pace between them, asking no one questions, whispering decisions before he ever spoke them aloud. In his private scrolls from this time, a rare entry. "The gods took what was soft from me. I will make of my grief a discipline." And so he did. But even the most orderly house cannot keep Rome's chaos forever at bay. In the soft hush of his later marriage years, Galba's household in Rome became more shrine than home. The laughter of children had long vanished, only the echo of it remained, haunting the atrium like the lingering scent of crushed laurel leaves. His servants moved like shadows across mosaic floors. His estate, once filled with senators, scholars, envoys, now stood in elegant silence, guarded more by memory than men. By this time, Galba was living in a grand villa near the Via Salaria, surrounded by sculptures, scrolls, and marble tributes to gods and ancestors. But his most faithful companion was not his family, nor his allies, but solitude. When asked why he had never adopted an heir, a practice common among Roman patricians, he would answer, coldly, "I trust the gods more than men." He did, however, keep close a circle of young men, scribes, guards, stewards, many of whom looked upon him as a distant father or mentor. But he never gave his name. Titus Finius remained the closest to Galba's private world, and though Rome's whispers turned ever sharper, suggesting favoritism or even forbidden intimacy, Galba never denied nor confirmed. He had long since learned that silence could be stronger than denial. There was one final flicker of softness in him, Helena, a niece of Aemilia, who came to live in his villa after her parents died. She was bright, observant, and unusually outspoken for a woman of her station. For a time, Galba seemed lighter in her company. He would read to her from the works of Livy, explain battle formations, and ask her thoughts on law. But when a proposal came from a senator to marry her, a union that would have secured Galba's influence, he refused it. No reason was ever given. Helena left not long after. Some say she wept. Others say she cursed his coldness. Galba never mentioned her again. But a painting of her frescoed onto a wall in a side chamber remained untouched until his death. It showed a young woman in a red stola beneath a fig tree, holding a scroll. Even in his power, Galba remained untouched by the warmth of lineage. The absence of heirs became a silence more deafening than any political enemy. It haunted him in small ways. A child's laugh in the street would make him pause. A senator's son, sitting beside his father in the Senate, would draw his glance. In private writings, he penned, "The empire bears no sons for me. I have ruled my own blood into exile." Rome demanded legacy, but Galba had none. Not one son to pass his name, not one daughter to honor his household gods. He lived in the bone structure of duty, with love long buried and memory turned to marble. And in the stillness of his villa, Galba prepared for something greater than marriage, the slow and bitter ascent to absolute power. The breath of empire turned cold in the year AD 33, when Galba was summoned again from the provinces. He had been tested already as consul under Tiberius, as governor of Gaul, and later in Africa, where his severity earned him both fear and admiration. But now, a more ominous shadow loomed, Caligula. Under Caligula's rule, madness and majesty danced side by side. The young emperor, barely past his 20s, declared himself a god, made his horse a priest, and executed senators for their dreams. It was a reign as radiant as it was deranged. And through it all, Galba kept still a Roman of the old ways, stoic and silent. He neither flattered nor resisted. He endured. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, and Claudius, limping, stammering, overlooked, was pulled from behind a curtain and declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard, Galba watched quietly from the countryside. Claudius, needing strong hands to govern the reaches of empire, appointed him governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, one of Rome's oldest and wealthiest provinces. Here, in the cool mountains and sunlit plains of northern Spain, Galba found something like peace. He governed for almost 8 years, balancing discipline with distant kindness. He built aqueducts, organized garrisons, reduced tax corruption. He avoided Roman games, parties, and the extravagance of the capital. Locals called him the Silent Eagle. His rule was steady, untouched by scandal or excess, but in that silence, he watched Rome rot. He kept scrolls of events from the capital, Nero's rise, his lavish spending, his theaters of cruelty. Galba read of how Nero murdered his mother, Agrippina, how he burned Christians in his gardens, how he performed on stage as if he were Apollo reborn. The Senate bent, the nobles fell silent, but Galba, far away in Spain, began to stir. By AD 67, the empire trembled. Rebellion was born in the east. The Judean War raged. In Gaul and Africa, murmurs grew louder. And then, the spark. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, raised the standard of revolt and called on Galba to declare himself emperor. At first, Galba hesitated. He was old now, past 70, stiff in his limbs, gray in the beard. But history, it seemed, had not forgotten him. With trembling hands, Galba took the imperial purple, stood before the legions of Hispania, and declared himself the rightful leader of Rome. He invoked liberty and the Senate, the forgotten ghosts of the Republic. He swore to restore Roman virtue, to tear down Nero's golden walls, and rebuild the soul of the empire. One line from his speech echoed across centuries. "I do not seek the empire. I obey the call of Rome." The path to Rome was long, not just in distance, but in memory. Galba, with white hair braided by wind and dust, led his legions from the highlands of Hispania Tarraconensis, across rivers and roads carved by centuries of Roman ambition. This was no triumphant parade, not yet. It was a march of uncertainty, of careful hope, tempered by the brutal rhythm of history. Behind him, nearly 7,000 legionaries followed, hardened men, old veterans, many of whom had fought under Germanicus, even under Tiberius. They believed in Galba, not for charm or splendor, but because he was the last echo of a republic long extinguished by emperors gone mad. As they moved through Gaul, towns opened their gates. Provinces pledged loyalty. The name Nero became a whisper spat into dirt. But power is never handed over. It must be seized delicately or violently. Though Gaius Julius Vindex had called Galba into the storm, he would not live to see its winds arrive. Defeated by Lucius Virginius Rufus in a tragic clash near Vesontio, Vindex took his own life. When news reached Galba, he sat in silence for hours beneath a cypress tree. The alliance was gone, but the war had begun. In Rome, Nero unraveled. The Senate turned its back. The Praetorian Guard, once fiercely loyal, was bought not with honor, but with promises. It was Nymphidius Sabinus, a cunning tribune, who offered them a future under Galba for the price of gold. The Guard, always hungry, always watching, shifted like wolves. Nero fled the city in terror. On a cold June morning in 68 AD, Nero Claudius Caesar, the last of Augustus's bloodline, drove a dagger into his throat and whispered, "Qualis artifex perio." What an artist dies in me. Galba, still en route to Rome, was hailed as emperor. But even as the imperial purple was offered, he made no pretense of joy. He entered the capital not in triumph, but in gravity, on foot, not chariot. He wore a wreath of laurel, not gold. Citizens lined the Via Appia, cheering, weeping, some from relief, others from fear of the unknown. The air was heavy with incense and uncertainty. The Senate greeted him as Servius Galba Caesar Augustus, giving him the sacred title. He responded with no thunderous speech, but a simple vow. No man shall buy the empire. Rome shall belong to Rome again. Yet, even as he entered the marble halls of the Palatine Hill, Galba knew this was not the end of the journey. It was only the start of a darker chapter, one where trust was poisoned, alliances thin, and blades sharper than ever. The reluctant emperor had come home, but would Rome accept him or consume him? Galba stood now in the heart of the empire, Rome, eternal and trembling. The marble halls of the Palatine Hill whispered of past emperors, of Augustus's careful cunning, of Tiberius's cold rule, of Caligula's insanity, and Nero's golden self-obsession. These corridors remembered blood and betrayal far more than peace. And now, a new name echoed through them, Galba. But power in Rome was not a crown to wear. It was a wreath of thorns. Galba began his rule not with celebration, but with austerity. He refused to pay the bribes promised to the Praetorian Guard by Nymphidius Sabinus. "I do not buy the empire," he said again, "and neither will I sell it." But the Guard, Rome's kingmakers, expected their price. In the shadows, grumblings became snarls. He dismissed corrupt officers, purged Nero's cronies, and stripped titles from unworthy men. Senators praised his virtue, but trembled beneath it. Galba was not cruel, but he was rigid. The empire had grown used to soft hands and golden lies. Galba offered none. In this fragile order, He turned to his inner circle, but even there, danger bloomed. He leaned heavily on three men, known bitterly as Galba's leash. Titus Vinius, a former general, brilliant, but reviled for greed. Cornelius Laco, head of the Praetorian Guard, slow in thought, paranoid in action. And Icelus, a freedman who whispered in the emperor's ear from behind closed curtains. They were seen as manipulative, power-hungry vultures tugging at an old man's robes. Galba trusted them, perhaps because he had no one else. Then came the question of succession. The empire had not forgotten the chaos of Nero's fall. Galba, now 71, was no longer fit for long campaigns or endless rule. The people, the Senate, even the legions wanted certainty. They wanted to know who would follow him. He chose Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus, a noble, young, disciplined Roman. Galba saw in him a reflection of the old republic honor without ambition. But there was a storm he failed to see rising. Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho, once governor of Lusitania and one of Nero's closest allies, had backed Galba's rise, expecting to be rewarded. Handsome, clever, dangerously charming Otho imagined himself heir to the empire. But when Galba passed him over for Piso, rage replaced loyalty. The wound was silent, but deep. The throne beneath Galba grew colder. Every reform he made cutting courtly excess, removing imperial luxury, restoring old taxes brought more whispers. He did not feast. He did not parade. He ruled as if Rome were still a republic. But Rome had changed. And so, the man who once walked into the city as savior now stood surrounded by rustling daggers and forced smiles. The old lion had taken the imperial seat, but Rome had become a den of younger, hungrier beasts. In the hush of Rome's winter mornings, beneath marble ceilings and golden mosaics, the softest whispers could kill. Galba's reign, barely a season old, now stood on a thread, and each step he took echoed with risk not on battlefields, but in corridors lined with silk and suspicion. Rome, in early January 69 AD, was uneasy. The streets remembered revolution, the markets gossiped in coded phrases, and the Praetorian Guard, insulted and unpaid, stood with arms polished, but hearts cold. Power had come swiftly, and it would not sit still. The betrayal, when it came, moved like a shadow, soundless, swift, and dressed in fine robes. Marcus Salvius Otho, jilted heir in waiting, once smiled at Galba as a son to a father. But Otho was no longer satisfied with patience. His pride burned too brightly. Spurned by the choice of Piso Licinianus, Otho began to weave the delicate net of rebellion, not with legions, but with coin and charisma. In the camp of the Praetorians, he moved quietly, hosting lavish dinners, making promises of wealth and pardon, whispering of Nero's golden age and of a new Rome with Otho at its helm. The guard, angry at Galba's austerity and empty purses, listened. Their loyalty unraveled, one denarius at a time. Galba knew something stirred. He could smell the iron in the air. He spoke of it in closed meetings with Laco, Vinius, and Icelus, but none acted. Laco hesitated, Icelus muttered of false rumors, and Vinius, always shrewd, warned against striking too soon. Galba, old and bound by law and reason, chose restraint. But in Rome, hesitation is betrayal's best friend. On the morning of January 15th, as dawn lighted the rooftops and smoke from bakeries rose into the pale sky, Otho rode secretly to the Praetorian camp. There, in a courtyard still wet with dew, the soldiers saluted him not as senator, but as emperor. It was done. Rome shivered. From the streets to the forum, murmurs spread faster than messengers. Galba, at the time in the Forum Romanum, surrounded by loyal guards and senators, was informed mid-procession. He stopped, turned to his co-consul, and said calmly, "If it is for the good of Rome, I am ready to die." There was no panic in his face, only the heavy, tired calm of a man who had seen too many betrayals to be surprised by one more. But betrayal would not wait. The sun rose higher over Rome, pale gold pouring down upon temples and tiled rooftops, but in the heart of the empire, something darker began to stir. The Praetorian Guard, who once protected emperors, now sharpened their blades in the name of another. Otho had made his move, and now Galba must decide how to fall. Within the marble halls of the palace on the Palatine, the aging emperor stood, his purple toga fastened with a simple golden clasp. Around him were the fluttering voices of advisors Laco, nervous and stammering, Icelus, desperate to flee, and Vinius, calm but calculating. They urged him, stay inside, call the legions, delay. But Galba would not hide. He looked to Piso Licinianus, the young man he had adopted just days ago, heir not only to the empire, but to its dangers. Galba placed his hands on the youth's shoulders and said, "It is not by hiding that an emperor earns dignity. If we must die, let us die as emperors, not fugitives." He gathered his cloak, drew no sword, and walked into the Forum Romanum. The streets had changed. The cheers were gone. Windows shut softly as he passed. The silence was heavier than any army. With a small escort loyal but outnumbered, he moved slowly, step by step, toward the Lacus Curtius, the symbolic heart of old Rome. It was there that chaos uncoiled. A detachment of Praetorian guards, now sworn to Otho, marched into view. Their armor glittered coldly in the morning light. Galba halted. Around him, senators melted into shadows. His guard, outnumbered and uncertain, looked to him, awaiting a command he would never give. He stood still. One of the guards shouted, "This is the traitor." Another stepped forward, Camerius, known once for his loyalty to Nero. He raised his sword. Galba did not plead. He did not run. Instead, he opened his arms and said only, "Strike, if this is what the Roman people want." The blade came down not once, but again and again. His body fell, trampled in the dust of the Forum. Beside him, young Piso was cornered and butchered at the Temple of Vesta, blood soaking the steps of the sacred flame. The old lion had walked willingly into the knife. But death did not come gently. His head was severed, carried through the streets, presented to Otho like a prize. And yet, even in death, Galba's eyes remained open, unblinking, unafraid. The city that once cried out for justice now tasted silence. When an emperor dies, the empire does not stop. It watches, it murmurs, it adjusts. But this time, something deeper cracked. The execution of Galba, in the very heart of Rome, sent shudders through marble and soul alike. The year of the four emperors had opened its second act with blood still wet on the stones of the Forum. The people, once roaring for Galba's arrival, now whispered behind veils. Some cursed his failure, others mourned the old man who dared walk to death with dignity, but most simply turned away. For Rome had grown used to the scent of death in her streets. His head, once crowned, now decorated a pike, paraded by soldiers loyal to Otho. It was shown not with ceremony, but with mockery, passed among the jeering crowds before being dumped unceremoniously by the Tiber's edge, where dogs and birds squabbled over forgotten flesh. And yet, Galba was not truly forgotten. In the provinces, news of his murder did not inspire peace, it ignited rebellion. Legions in Germania, once uncertain under Galba's rule, now burned with fury. They rejected Otho's claim. They raised a new name, Vitellius. Rome, unstable and stunned, faced a storm of its own making. Even Otho, the beneficiary of the betrayal, found no joy in the blood he had spilled. In private, he spoke of Galba with strange reverence, how the old man had faced death with the calm of a god, not a fallen king. He ordered Galba's remains to be gathered and buried, though the ashes were few. A quiet tomb was raised near the gardens of Sallust, shaded by cypress and silence. No great funeral, no public mourning, just a city moving forward with heavy feet, as Rome always had. But among the senators, the echoes lingered. They whispered of Galba's final words, of his discipline, of how he stood for the old republic's virtues in an age that no longer wanted them. He had been austere, unbending, and perhaps doomed from the start. He had believed that Rome could be ruled by reason again. Rome had reminded him otherwise. Galba's death had left more than just a silence. It had torn open the soul of an empire. The throne was not vacant for long, yet it felt hollow. Otho, once Galba's ally and now his usurper, ascended the steps of power on a stairwell built of betrayal. The purple robe he wore seemed heavy with ghostly hands, hands of the old man he had cast down. But Galba's reign, though brief, was not without the shaping force of conflict. Even in life, he had faced the unseen battles not of swords, but of spirits. His greatest war had not been with nations, but with Rome itself. As news of his murder spread like oil across fire, the provinces flared. In Germania, the legions who once eyed Galba with suspicion now cried out in vengeance, not for love of him, but in fury against the chaos. They declared for Aulus Vitellius, a man bloated with appetites but also cunning commander of the Rhine legions, and a name now painted on every shield in the north. The empire split, like bronze under pressure. Galba's allies, what few remained, were either dead or silenced. But echoes of his rule shaped the coming war. His strict discipline, his rejection of bribery and spectacle, had set a tone that none of his successors could match. The empire felt the absence of that cold order, and in that vacuum, ambition stirred. Otho prepared for war, but Galba's ghost, real or imagined, haunted his every move. At night, in the imperial chamber where Galba had once walked in contemplation, Otho paced. He remembered how Galba had walked to death with calm eyes, how the people had turned. He worried he might share that same fate. And in many ways, he would. For the battles that came next, the great clashes at Bedriacum, the rallying of fractured legions, the endless march of ironclad feet were born not just of power, but of what Galba had tried to resist. The turning of emperorship into auction, and Rome into a feast of ambition. The ashes of Galba drifted behind every soldier. His failed ideals, once laughed at, now seemed holy in the face of what followed. Because what followed was war. Across the fractured spine of the Roman Empire, the sky grew darker. From the frosted northern frontiers to the warm coasts of Italia, legions marched under different names, yet all beneath the same tired eagle. Galba was gone, but the empire he had failed to mend was now unraveling in earnest, and each thread bled red. In Germania Inferior, Vitellius declared himself emperor, not with elegance, but with gluttony. He was a man of appetites, feasts, games, power. His soldiers adored him for his generosity, his open purse, and his disregard for noble heirs. Unlike Galba, who had withheld gifts from the praetorians, Vitellius showered his troops with coin, wine, and promises. But the road to Rome ran through Otho, who now sat on Galba's blood-warmed throne, trying to rule a realm already set aflame. The decisive clash would come at Bedriacum, in the Po Valley, where the legions of Otho and Vitellius would meet beneath a moon-soaked sky. Rome's future would be chosen not by vote or virtue, but by the scream of steel. Galba's memory was silent, yet somehow present. Otho, restless and aging with each passing hour, whispered of him often to his generals. He would speak in the tented shadows, recalling how Galba had walked to death calmly, with his hands open, like a sacrifice. He may have been harsh, Otho murmured one night, but he was Roman, truly Roman. At Bedriacum, the battle broke like thunder. 10,000 men clashed in a chaos of dust and spear points. Standards fell, centurions shouted orders into deaf winds. Bodies tumbled into the mud, their armor shattered. The legions fought not for glory, but to crown one man over another. It was a civil war with no foreign foe, only mirror images drenched in Roman blood. Otho's forces, though brave, were scattered and outmaneuvered. As defeat approached, he knew the ghosts of Rome would not abide another emperor who clung to power through violence. So Otho chose death. Just as Galba had stood in the forum with open arms, Otho sat in his tent and drove a dagger into his own heart. He died with a whisper. Let others live, if Rome must. Galba had set a precedent: death before dishonor, calm before collapse. The cycle turned once more. Across the fractured spine of the Roman Empire, the sky grew darker. From the frosted northern frontiers to the warm coasts of Italia, legions marched under different names, yet all beneath the same tired eagle. Galba was gone, but the empire he had failed to mend was now unraveling in earnest, and each thread bled red. In Germania Inferior, Vitellius declared himself emperor, not with elegance, but with gluttony. He was a man of appetites, feasts, games, power. His soldiers adored him for his generosity, his open purse, and his disregard for noble heirs. Unlike Galba, who had withheld gifts from the praetorians, Vitellius showered his troops with coin, wine, and promises. But the road to Rome ran through Otho, who now sat on Galba's blood-warmed throne, trying to rule a realm already set aflame. The decisive clash would come at Bedriacum, in the Po Valley, where the legions of Otho and Vitellius would meet beneath a moon-soaked sky. Rome's future would be chosen not by vote or virtue, but by the scream of steel. Galba's memory was silent, yet somehow present. Otho, restless and aging with each passing hour, whispered of him often to his generals. He would speak in the tented shadows, recalling how Galba had walked to death calmly, with his hands open, like a sacrifice. He may have been harsh, Otho murmured one night, but he was Roman, truly Roman. At Bedriacum, the battle broke like thunder. 10,000 men clashed in a chaos of dust and spear points. Standards fell. Centurions shouted orders into deaf winds. Bodies tumbled into the mud, their armor shattered. The legions fought not for glory, but to crown one man over another. It was a civil war with no foreign foe, only mirror images drenched in Roman blood. Otho's forces, though brave, were scattered and outmaneuvered. As defeat approached, he knew the ghosts of Rome would not abide another emperor who clung to power through violence. So Otho chose death. Just as Galba had stood in the forum with open arms, Otho sat in his tent and drove a dagger into his own heart. He died with a whisper. Let others live, if Rome must. Galba had set a precedent: death before dishonor, calm before collapse. The cycle turned once more. Even as the dust of war settled, and Rome tried once more to find her breath, Galba's name refused to die. It lingered like smoke in the Senate, echoed in marble corridors, and clung to the hearts of those who had once believed in a Roman order that could not be bought. Now, under the fourth emperor of the year, Vespasian the empire sought stability. He was not cut from the cloth of theater or nobility. Vespasian was a soldier, hardened in the dust of Judea, carrying the scars of real battles, not courtly intrigues. He entered Rome not with feasts or fireworks, but with discipline, taxation, and silence. He claimed the throne not as a king, but as a caretaker. And in this quiet, Galba returned not in body, but in spirit. Vespasian ordered the archives reopened. He reviewed Galba's decrees, studied his brief reforms, and rescinded the curses placed upon his name. In quiet circles, Galba was no longer a failed emperor, but a cautionary tale turned blueprint. His severity, once mocked, was now seen as necessary medicine for a spoiled empire. But Rome's blood was still thick with ambition, and peace was never simple. The Flavian dynasty, though stronger than its predecessors, found enemies in shadows. Old senators, embittered by Galba's death and the mockery of Otho and Vitellius, plotted again. Loyalists to the fallen emperor whispered of resurrection, of secret heirs, of divine justice yet to come. Assassins stirred. Coins with Galba's face were found newly minted in Hispania. Anonymous letters reached the Senate, signed, "Servant of the Forgotten Emperor." A statue of Galba was erected overnight in the Forum, garlanded with flowers and torn down by dawn. Within Vespasian's own palace, his younger son Domitian studied these things closely. He asked about Galba often. Was he strong, or only stubborn? He asked. Was death a weakness, or a crown? The echoes of Galba's fall-bred paranoia. Vespasian's spies uncovered plots from exiled generals, failed politicians, and surviving guards from Galba's brief court. Some wanted revenge, others only chaos. but all wore his name like a banner of resistance. So the emperor did what emperors must. He silenced them, quietly, efficiently, beneath torchlight, in lonely corridors, in the whispers of poison and exile. And still, the ghost of Galba wandered. Whispers turned to symbols, symbols turned to chants, and soon, Galba's name was no longer merely remembered, it was revived. Across the empire, from Lusitania, where he was born, to the back streets of Rome, a strange and quiet movement began to grow. It did not call for Galba's return, for he was long dead, but for his virtus, his austere Roman discipline, his incorruptibility. They painted his initials SG, Servius Galba, on walls. They carried medallions marked with the profile of the emperor who had ruled but 7 months. The empire, still shaken from the year of the 4 emperors, was not blind to it. Vespasian had begun his own reforms, a new coinage, a restored senate, taxation to refill empty coffers. Yet the Galbian loyalists, now calling themselves Custodes Ferretae, the Iron Guardians, claimed these acts were inspired not by Vespasian's own will, but by Galba's ghostly influence. They believed that Galba had planted the seeds of this new order, and Vespasian was merely tending his garden. This idea, however poetic, was dangerous. In Gaul, a garrison of discontented veterans raised Galba's banners during a minor tax revolt. The provincial governor, fearing rumors of resurrection, had their leaders flayed and crucified. In Africa, a former centurion who had once served in Galba's guard declared himself the true heir of the Galban flame, and led a failed march toward Carthage, where he was burned alive in the amphitheater. Meanwhile, in Rome, more subtle daggers were drawn. A senator named Marcus Caecilius Silanus, rumored to have once been Galba's secret advisor, began forging alliances with minor noble families who had been wronged during Vitellius's short, violent reign. He invoked Galba's reforms in his speeches. He accused the current court of slipping into decadence again. His popularity surged. Then, he vanished. No funeral, no decret, no body. Just a single sandal, found bloodied at the Tiber's edge. From the Palatine Hill, Domitian watched. He listened, and in the deep, cold corridors of power, he learned. He saw how even a dead emperor could inspire fear. He understood that legacy, if wielded like a sword, could cut more deeply than a legion ever could. He etched Galba's name into a wax tablet, and hid it in a locked box in his chambers. What was a ghost, after all, but a lesson unheeded? By the time the winter of 74 AD settled over Rome, the name Galba had become more than dangerous, it had become divine in the eyes of a few. A small cult had formed deep in the Suburra, Rome's poorest and most crowded district. They met in abandoned insulae, beneath the cracked foundations of forgotten villas. Their symbols were scratched on amphorae and sewer bricks, a dagger over a laurel, always flanked by the initials SG. They whispered of a prophecy that Galba had not truly died, that he had been transfigured, a soul of iron reborn in marble, awaiting Rome's darkest hour to rise again. It was nonsense, of course. And yet, it was enough. In the Palatine palaces, the name began to unsettle dreams. Even Emperor Vespasian, now older, began to doubt whether he had truly extinguished the flame of Galba. He had tried to imitate the dead emperor's fiscal reforms, embracing frugality, reducing court excesses, dismissing sycophants, yet the people still remembered Galba as the face of incorruptible Rome. Even the soldiers spoke of him with reverence. When statues of the emperors were toppled in provincial riots, Galba's were spared. In the garrison at Lugdunum, a young commander was overheard saying, "Galba failed because he was not cruel. If he had ruled as Vespasian does now, he'd still wear the purple." That commander was executed by sunrise. In private, Domitian, now maturing into a brooding, calculated man, kept the myth of Galba close. He studied his brief reign obsessively. He saw in it a lesson, that ruling justly was not enough. One must also rule without mercy. And thus, the irony deepened. Galba, who had died for being too harsh, too unyielding, was now being transformed into a model of strength by a generation hardened by chaos. The very traits that earned him betrayal now became the virtues Rome craved. And the cult beneath the Subura? They were discovered. The Praetorian Guard raided their meeting place by torchlight. 100 were arrested, but only 12 were executed. When asked for their last words, one man looked skyward and said, "Galba did not die. He was born too soon." Rome trembled at the line. So did Domitian. For as much as the empire tried to silence Galba, his name had become woven into every conversation of power, every fear of the Senate, every rebellion of a governor, every hesitation in the emperor's gaze. He had failed, and yet his shadow endured. And so, the final threat Galba posed was not an army or a rebellion, but memory itself. A memory that refused to lie still. Years passed. Wars waned. The empire entered a season of calm. But somewhere, beneath Rome's gilded surface, the story of Galba still lingered, not like a wound, but like a memory that refused to dim. The age of Vespasian, and then his sons Titus and Domitian, saw the rebirth of imperial strength. Temples were rebuilt, roads were paved anew. The great Colosseum rose, its arches triumphant, its purpose brutal. Yet, even amid the thunder of games and the praise of poets, whispers of Galba would slip between conversation like drifting smoke. Galba had built no marble colossus. His legacy had not been in spectacles, but in structure invisible pillars holding up the weight of empire. It was he, after all, who first restored the treasury in the wake of Nero's ruin. It was Galba who abolished court excesses, reintroduced traditional senatorial council, and attempted to cut the bloated military stipends that had turned legions into auctioneers of emperors. Though these measures earned him no popularity in his lifetime, they quietly set the tone for those who followed. Even Vespasian, a shrewd survivor of civil war, followed Galba's blueprint when reforming the finances. He once confessed to his son Titus in private. Galba was not loved, but he was not wrong. In distant Hispania, where Galba had governed for years before becoming emperor, monuments were quietly erected, not grand, but heartfelt. A small forum in Tarraco bore his name. A marble slab in Emerita Augusta recorded his dedication to justice in provincial disputes. In Rome, a copy of his edicts was preserved in the Tabularium, the state archives. One in particular became a guiding principle for future emperors. A ruler must not please, but preserve, for flattery feeds ruin, and silence raises tyrants. Even the Senate, once cold to his name, began to quote him in debates. His harshness, once feared, was now framed as discipline. His severity, once resented, was now seen as clarity. By the time Trajan rose as century's best ruler, born near where Galba once ruled in Spain, Galba's story had changed. He was no longer remembered solely as the emperor who ruled for 7 months and died in blood. He was recalled as the one who tried to steady a storm with discipline alone. It wasn't that Galba had succeeded, it was that he had dared. And that bravery, in a city drunk on flattery and gold, became a kind of unspoken monument, one carved not in stone, but in memory. The golden age of the Roman Empire gleamed with the polished veneer of triumph, but beneath every polished surface, behind every triumphal arch, there lingered the echo of men who built not for applause, but for endurance. And among those names, Galba was remembered as something rare, a man who tried to mend rather than conquer. It was during the early reign of Trajan, Rome's philosopher-warrior, that the Senate authorized the creation of a commemorative bronze relief in the Forum of Augustus. The relief, subtle and set into the eastern wall, depicted Galba not on a throne or in battle, but in the act of returning a purse of coins to the treasury, his toga wrapped modestly, his eyes gazing toward a scroll of the law. It was a portrait, not of power, but of duty. Nearby, a small statue was raised in Emerita Augusta, Galba's favored Spanish province. The inscription read simply, "He gave what Rome needed, not what it wanted." There were no grand monuments, no golden domes in his name. Galba's memory had taken root in a different way in laws still referenced, in the simplicity of justice applied, and in whispered admiration from those who believed that strength came not from show, but from order. In private schools, tutors would read Galba's Edictum de Rebus Frumentarius, a forgotten grain law meant to stabilize prices and prevent hoarding. Children would recite his saying, "To lead well is not to be feared, but to be trusted." It became common for young magistrates across the provinces in Gaul, in Bithynia, in Mauritania to carry a small signet ring engraved with Galba's profile. Not as a fashion, but as a symbol. Justice without luxury, authority without pride. Even Emperor Hadrian, known for his stoic poise and distant demeanor, confessed once in a letter to the Senate. Galba taught us that a year of restraint is worth 10 of splendor. Yet his story remained quiet, almost hidden, as if Rome herself was ashamed of how she had treated him. There were no triumphal reenactments, no litanies sung in temples. Galba had ruled for too short and died too coldly to become a romantic hero. But the empire he had once tried to reform now remembered him not with fire, but with reverence, a hushed kind of memory, carved into the habits of responsible governance, etched into scrolls, whispered in the shadows of brighter emperors. Rome, in its grandeur, did not often reward those who gave her boundaries. But in Galba's case, time had quietly reversed the sentence. As Rome drifted further into its golden age, it was easy to forget those who had bled in silence. Yet Galba's story did not vanish. It lived in the bones of the law, in provincial reforms, and in the quiet reflections of future leaders. By the time of Antoninus Pius, the empire was enjoying one of its most tranquil eras. Trade flourished from the coasts of Britannia to the sands of Egypt. Peace endured not because of conquest, but because of structure laws, discipline, and governance. And in the shaded corners of the imperial archives, Galba's edicts were still being copied by candlelight. In Pergamon, a wealthy senator commissioned a small library alcove titled Domus Galbae, where scrolls of republican and early imperial jurisprudence were kept. The walls bore a faded fresco. Galba in his military cloak, standing in a courtroom, hand raised not in command, but in judgment. Above him, inscribed in Latin, "In the absence of love, let there at least be justice." A humble inscription. And yet, it drew students, governors, and even prefects from distant provinces who came to sit in that quiet space, reading the wisdom of one who ruled briefly, yet thought deeply. Later, in the twilight years of Marcus Aurelius, when stoicism shaped thought and silence became noble, Galba's image returned again. Marcus himself, burdened by war and death, once wrote in his meditations, "Galba held power in his hands as one holds fire lightly, for fear it might consume him. From him I learned the measure of a ruler." No gilded triumph could grant such praise. In death, Galba had earned what he never received in life respect. Statues of Galba were rare, but placed with meaning. A bust in the archives of the Temple of Concord, a relief in the gardens of the Villa Hadriana, and a coin minted in limited numbers under Hadrian, bearing the words, "A Justitia Parissa, justice endures." By the end of the 2nd century, few Romans spoke of his fall. Instead, they remembered the man who dared say no to indulgence, who refused bribes, who executed corrupt commanders, even if it cost him everything. And perhaps that is why Galba was not celebrated in song or statue, but in the habits of empire itself, in ledgers kept clean, in judgments made fairly, in governors who looked to service rather than splendor. He became Rome's conscience. Not its flame, not its sword, but the stone beneath the foundation. The winds of January in Rome cut sharper than swords. In the winter of 69 AD, the eternal city bristled not with joy, but with whispers, and Galba, old and weathered, stood on the steps of the Palatium, his toga wrapped tight, his eyes lost somewhere beyond the red tile rooftops. He had come to power not in youth's fire, but in the cooling ash of age and doubt. At 71, he was not a man of dreams, but of burdens. He had fought for Rome under emperors mad and cruel, served as governor across Hispania, and waited decades in patient silence. And now, after Nero's fall, the crown had fallen on his reluctant brow like a crown of lead. The Senate had hoped for order. The army had hoped for reward. The people had hoped for change. Galba gave them discipline. But Rome, chaotic and decadent, was not in the mood for restraint. As weeks passed, resentment festered. The Praetorian Guard, hungry for coin, saw promises broken. Senators, once loyal, now moved in shadows. And Galba, refusing to play their games, spoke words that chilled even his closest advisors. "I choose no heir by favor, only by Rome's need." It was then he named Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus as his successor, young, principled, a choice of virtue over popularity. But in doing so, he spurned Marcus Salvius Otho, a man of ambition, influence, and vengeance. Otho, a longtime ally of Galba, had expected to be adopted. Instead, he was cast aside, his pride wounded, his hunger ignited. He began to whisper to the Praetorian Guard, feeding them silver and promises. Galba's advisors begged him to act to arrest Otho, to sweeten the guard with bribes, but Galba refused. "Let them kill me if Rome cannot stomach law." And so, on the morning of January 15th, 69 AD, as Galba rode through the forum on a litter, surrounded by his lictors and followed by Piso, the guards struck. Swords drawn in daylight. Cries in the stone corridors. Blood spilled across the Lacus Curtius, the legendary spot where, long ago, a Roman knight had leapt into a chasm to save the city. Galba fell beside it, cut down not by enemies of Rome, but by her guardians. Bystanders wept in silence, others fled. Piso, too, was murdered in the temple of Vesta. And Otho was proclaimed emperor by nightfall. Galba's body lay cold in the forum, but the city did not pause. No temple bells rang. No funeral procession carved its way through the sacred streets. The man who had once been hailed as liberator from Nero was now simply another name carved in stone, then crossed out. His severed head was brought to Otho as a gift. They say it was thrown at his feet, still bearing the lines of age and the gaze of pride. For a moment, even Otho was silent. Not out of guilt, but recognition. Galba had been more than an emperor. He was a mirror reflecting what Rome no longer wanted to see. Galba's allies Titus Vinius, Cornelius Laco, Icelus Marcianus had all been killed or vanished within hours. His heir, Piso, was dragged from the temple of Vesta, his blood soaking the very altar of the Vestal Virgins. Yet, even as Rome celebrated Otho, a strange quiet settled over the Senate. There were no cheers of unity, no declarations of divine favor, only unease. Galba's execution had not cleared the storm, it had ignited it. Within weeks, civil war engulfed the empire. Vitellius, marching from the German provinces, claimed the throne for himself. Otho, perhaps in regret or desperation, took his own life by sword, rather than plunge the empire deeper into chaos. And so began the year of the four emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and eventually Vespasian. Rome bled, provinces fractured, legions turned on legions. And somewhere amid the ashes, Galba's quiet rule, so brief, so strict, so unloved, began to seem almost merciful. Though no grand tomb was built for him, whispers say a simple urn holding his ashes was placed by surviving loyalists in the gardens of the house of Livia, beneath the olive trees. There was no inscription, only a faded laurel branch carved in stone. Time softened his name. No public monuments bore his face, yet in dusty archives and military logs, his edicts continued to echo. A century later, the historian Tacitus wrote of him, "Galba governed, not for love, nor for ambition, but for Rome. And Rome, ungrateful, impatient, and ravenous, devoured him before it understood." These were not the words of triumph, but of lament. Galba, in death, became a lesson. Not one of glory, but of consequence. Years passed, like the slow drifting of ash, over Pompeian rooftops. The year of the four emperors faded into pages, and the empire, though bloodied, did not fall. From the chaos emerged Vespasian, builder of peace and of the Colosseum, restorer of the Senate's dignity. Under his rule, Rome exhaled again. But Galba? His name was spoken rarely, and only in quiet tones, not in scorn, but in solemnity. There was no triumphal arch bearing his image, no golden bust in the forum. And yet, among the elder senators and grizzled centurions, there lingered a strange respect. They remembered a man who never promised lies, who ruled briefly and died for it. He had taken the purple, not out of hunger, but duty, and Rome, rabid with expectation, had found his calm a kind of betrayal. Yet it was Galba's brief reign that revealed the rotted spine of power. It laid bare the hunger of the Praetorian Guard, the fickleness of the Senate, and the dangerous lust of commanders in distant provinces. When later emperors sought to restore dignity to Rome, they would quietly cite Galba's laws, his reforms against waste, his attempts to return lost lands, his refusal to enrich his court with blood money. Though the empire had buried him, it found itself echoing him. Even Vespasian, the new hope, once remarked to a friend, "Galba taught us what Rome resents and what it needs." Galba's household, scattered by the coup, never rose again. There were no sons, no bloodline. His wealth had been seized, and his estate fell into imperial hands. But his ashes, resting still beneath those Livia gardens, were sometimes visited by former soldiers who had marched with him in Hispania. They would bring olive branches, offer a salute, and whisper words in old Latin, not of politics, but of friendship. In the quiet streets of the Vella Brum, where market stalls now bustled with fruit and laughter, a young girl once asked her grandfather, a retired legionary, who was Galba? And the old man, eyes damp with age, replied, "A man who walked straight in a crooked world." In the pantheon of Rome's great rulers, the Caesars, the builders, the monsters, the gods, the name Galba is barely whispered. He reigned for just 7 months, a flicker of flame amid storms. But sometimes, even the shortest fire can leave the longest shadows. Long after he was gone, and after the swords that slew him had rusted to dust, scholars in quiet libraries came upon his name again, not in grand poetry, nor epic marble, but in laws, edicts, and unanswered letters. His reforms against corruption, his attempt to restore financial order, his refusal to bribe the praetorians, these were buried beneath the clamor of civil war, but not forgotten. The empire would not sing his name in triumph, yet in times of trouble, those who sought to do right rather than gain favor would find quiet kinship in Galba's forgotten example. In the Capitoline archives, a dusty scroll bears the title De Justitia Principis, on the justice of the princeps. It is unsigned, but many believe it to be the words of Galba himself. In it, he writes, "To rule is not to be loved. It is to carry the burden others fear. To say no when yes is easier. To speak softly when the people shout." No grand monuments survive. His villa near Tarraco, where he once dreamed of quiet retirement, was consumed by fire during a provincial revolt decades later. The palace on the Palatine, where he reigned, would later be remodeled by Domitian, erasing every trace of his existence, even down to the mosaics. Yet some things cannot be undone. Centuries after his death, a mosaic floor in Hispania was uncovered, bearing a simple olive tree flanked by the letters SG. Scholars still debate the meaning, but among the old families of that province, a story is passed from father to son. Galba once walked these lands, not as emperor, as man, and he was good. In distant provinces like Baetica and Gallia Narbonensis, local magistrates long followed edicts once signed by his hand, even after Rome had officially replaced them. To those cities, he was not a failed emperor, he was a just one. In Roman legal texts, his name appears rarely, but always beside the word moderationis, meaning restraint. Not a title many emperors earned. He had tried to bring discipline to indulgence, duty to desire, and Rome, unready for such chains, chose blood over balance. But time, like the Tiber, always circles back. Even in the dust of forgotten emperors, some names drift back like half-remembered songs. Galba's was one of those soft, elusive, and often misunderstood. He did not build golden palaces or stage cruel spectacles. He left no heir, no grand tomb, no victory column scraping the Roman sky. And yet, his silence spoke louder than many triumphs. In the ruins of the Forum, beneath cracked marble and wild fig roots, there is a forgotten plinth where a statue once stood. No name remains carved, no bronze silhouette survives, only the faint imprint of sandaled feet. Some say it was Galba's. Others claim the stone was never marked at all. But the people who still visit leave olive branches and tiny coins in tribute, as if to say, "We remember, even if history tried to forget." Galba's death was brutal, a blade to the neck in the bitter January air. But his spirit's departure was gentle, slipping from Rome like mist from the Tiber. As the chaos of civil war swallowed the city, his memory escaped the grasp of those who would tarnish or rewrite it. He became a quiet symbol of order, not of victory, but of principle. Philosophers centuries later would write of a ruler who bore the burden without the vanity, and the Stoics, those keepers of calm in a tempestuous world, would occasionally quote him in their teachings. Though never canonized, he was respected in the hearts of those who valued restraint, justice, and duty. In Baetica, an altar to Justitia still bears a weathered inscription: "To the one who ruled with weight, not with whim." And somewhere in the halls of old patrician villas, places where ivy now grows through cracked mosaics, the portrait of a gaunt, tired emperor sometimes lingers on a wall, unpolished, half-faded, but left untouched. Some say the Praetorian Guard never again trusted fully in their own cause after betraying Galba. That even they, fierce and cruel, had sensed something was different about the man who refused to buy their loyalty and died for it. And in the minds of the people, especially the old ones, Galba's name became less a figure of politics and more a kind of gentle ghost. A reminder, a whispered lesson. Not all who fall are failures. And so, his name, once shouted in the marble corridors of power, faded into whispers. His footsteps no longer echoed across the Palatine. His ring, once kissed by senators, lies buried beneath layers of forgotten time. Yet, even now, when the torchlight flickers in empty chambers, the presence of Galba lingers not in triumph, but in quiet understanding. In dreams, he does not return as a conqueror, but as a tired old man, once again walking the colonnades of his villa in Terrico, where vines curl gently around columns and the sea hums in the distance. His hands no longer tremble with the burden of power. The dagger never reaches him here. In this place of memory, he is finally at peace. The wars, the betrayals, the shouts of the mob, they all grow distant now, like birds taking flight. The empire churns on without him, its emperors rising and falling like waves, each one louder, bloodier, more desperate than the last. But Galba's story is a still pool amid that storm, a place where justice was briefly more important than spectacle. The olive tree he once planted in Hispania, so small in his time now, stands tall over a quiet hillside, its roots deep, its branches open to the stars. Villagers pass beneath it and do not know the name of the man who first dug that soil. But they still feel the calm it gives. That is his legacy. No triumphal arch bears his name. No golden eagle guards his grave. But if you walk among the ruins, and you are very quiet, you may hear it, just beneath the wind. A voice that says not, "I ruled," but, "I tried." In the sleep of history, Galba does not demand remembrance. He only asks not to be misunderstood. And in these quiet hours of the night, as we close our eyes, perhaps he is closest to us, this tired man who bore the weight of Rome for a brief and burning moment. He lived, he failed, he hoped, and he let go. And now? Sleep well, weary listener. Let the marble walls of Rome fade behind you. Let the flickering torches of the Forum go dark. Galba has become one with the silence of history. His footsteps are no longer heard. But if you listen closely, the wind still whispers his name in the ruins of the Roman Empire. Sleep well, now. Let time carry you away.